On my 60th birthday, my daughter pulled me away from the guests and leaned close to ask about the house, about what was going to happen to it, about the path forward for the family. I looked her straight in the eyes and said quietly, "You're too late. That house hasn't belonged to me for months." Her face instantly drained of color. My son-in-law froze where he stood. Before the party was even over, the two of them disappeared without saying goodbye. What happened over the next few days proved they had never come for my birthday in the first place. I'm grateful you chose Dad Family Revenge today. Quick question before we begin: where are you joining us from? Drop your city or country below. You'd be surprised how far this community reaches. Note this story includes fictional elements for entertainment and educational purposes. Names and settings are coincidental. The lesson, however, is not. I need you to understand something about the kitchen before I tell you anything else. It was yellow. Not the pale, apologetic yellow you see in houses where someone picked a color from a catalog and called it a day. It was a real yellow, warm and deliberate, the kind that holds the morning light and gives it back to you slowly. Joyce mixed the paint herself at the hardware store on Burnside, spent 20 minutes arguing with the color chips until she found exactly what she was looking for. She came home with 2 gallons a roller and a look on her face that told me she'd already decided and wasn't interested in my opinion. "You're not going to ask me," I said, standing in the doorway of what was then an ordinary white kitchen. "Ask you what?" she said, already pulling the lid off the first can. "Whether I like yellow." She looked up at me with those brown eyes that had a way of making me feel like the smartest and dumbest man alive at the same time. "Richard," she said, "you're going to love it." Love. She was right. I loved it the moment it went on the walls, and I loved it every morning after that for 31 years, sitting across from her at the oak table she'd found at a garage sale in Milwaukee, drinking coffee while the sun came through the window and turned everything golden. Joyce always gave me the bigger mug. She said it was because I needed more caffeine to function. The truth was, she just liked watching me wrap both hands around it like it was something precious. That was Joyce. She showed love in the small things, the things you only notice if you're paying attention. Sticky notes tucked into my lunch bag. Not love letters, nothing dramatic, just things like, "Don't forget the Henderson meeting," or "Pick up milk the real kind." But sometimes, maybe once a month, I'd open my bag at my desk and find one that just said, "I'm glad you're mine." I kept every one of those. They're in a shoebox in the closet of my apartment now, and I still can't open it without my chest tightening, like something inside me is trying to hold on. We had 31 years together in that house on Wisteria Lane in Lake Oswego. I'd bought it in 1991 with a down payment I'd been saving since I was 24 years old, working maintenance for Portland Public Schools, fixing boilers, replacing roof panels, crawling under buildings in the January cold to repair pipe insulation that had given up the fight. I worked my way up over the decades from a junior technician with a tool belt and a thermos to director of facilities management, overseeing a team of 43 people and a budget that would have made my 24-year-old self fall out of his chair. I retired in January of 2025, exactly on my 60th birthday. Joyce had always said I should retire at 60 and not a day later. "You've given enough of your back to other people's buildings," she told me once, rubbing her hands along my shoulders after a particularly brutal week. "At 60, you give the rest to me." She didn't make it to 60. The heart attack came in March of 2021. Fast, the doctors said, as if that was a comfort. She was at school. She'd gone back to substitute teaching 2 days a week just to keep busy, and by the time the paramedics arrived, there wasn't much left to do. The school called me at 10:47 in the morning. I was in a budget meeting. I stepped out into the hallway to take the call and stood there for a long time after it ended, holding the phone against my chest, staring at a fire extinguisher mounted on the wall, thinking about how Joyce had always said those things were eyesores, and somebody ought to paint them a nicer color. I don't remember driving to the hospital. I remember being there. And I remember a doctor, whose name I never caught, saying words that rearranged the furniture of my entire life. And I remember walking out into the parking lot afterward and sitting on the curb like a man who'd forgotten which direction was home. Sandra Kowalski, our neighbor from 3 houses down, showed up at my door the next morning with a casserole dish and red eyes that told me she'd been crying since the night before. She didn't say much. She just handed me the dish and said, "You don't have to eat it today." I ate it standing over the sink at 2 in the afternoon, and I cried into it. And then I washed the dish and set it by the door to return to her, and that was the first day. Pastor Dale Whitmore called every Sunday for the first 3 months. He never pushed, never preached, never told me Joyce was in a better place in that particular tone of voice that makes you want to hang up. He just called and said, "How are you holding up, Richard?" and listened to whatever I said. Sometimes I said fine. Sometimes I said terrible. He accepted both answers equally, which I appreciated more than I can properly explain. And then there was Vanessa. My daughter was 30 years old when Joyce died, living in a house in Beaverton, with her husband Ethan working an online retail building, what she called her brand. She drove over the morning after I called her, and she held on to me in the front doorway so hard I could feel her shaking, and she said, "I've got you, Dad. I've got you," over and over into my shoulder while her own voice broke apart. In those first months, she called every few days. She brought food. She sat with me in the yellow kitchen and told me stories about her mother, the time Joyce had accidentally dyed her hair green, trying to go Auburn, the way she used to sing completely wrong lyrics to every song on the radio and defend them fiercely when corrected. Vanessa had her mother's laugh, this sudden, bright thing that caught you off guard, and every time I heard it in that kitchen, I felt both grateful and gutted at the same time. My grandson Cooper was 5 years old, then a round-faced boy with his grandmother's eyes and a habit of asking questions that stopped you cold. He came over one afternoon, a few months after the funeral, ran straight to the framed photo of Joyce on the living room shelf, and pointed at it with one small finger. "Was Grandma pretty, Grandpa?" he asked. I crouched down next to him and my throat went tight in that way it still does when I'm not expecting it. "She was the best thing I ever saw," I told him. Cooper nodded seriously, like he was filing this information away for later. Then he ran off to look at something else the way 5-year-olds do, carrying no weight at all, and I stayed crouched there for a moment longer than I needed to, one hand on the shelf breathing through it. For a while after Joyce died, it was just me and Vanessa. And for a while, I want to be honest about this, that felt like enough. Vanessa knew how to make an entrance. Not the loud kind, she was too smart for that. Her entrances were soft and perfectly timed. She'd show up at my door on a Sunday afternoon with a container of soup and a smile that made Sandra Kowalski, watching from across the yard, press a hand to her heart and say, "That girl is just like her mother." She wasn't, but I didn't know that yet. In the 2 years after Joyce died, Vanessa built something I can only describe as a performance, and I mean that in the most carefully constructed sense of the word. She posted photos of the two of us on her social media, her arm around my shoulders, my face caught mid-laugh with captions like, "No matter how busy life gets, family always comes first," and "Grateful for every moment with this man." Sandra shared every single one. Pastor Dale Whitmore mentioned to me after Sunday service one morning that he'd seen the photos and that I was lucky to have such a devoted daughter. I smiled and said I knew it. Ethan came along for some of these visits, always pleasant, always dressed a little too well for a Sunday afternoon. He had a handshake that was just firm enough and a way of laughing at things that made you feel like he was performing laughter rather than actually feeling it. The first time he came to the house alone with Vanessa, he walked through the living room, slowly pausing at the built-in shelves, his eyes moving across the space the way a contractor's eyes move across a room, measuring, calculating, assigning value. "Beautiful place, Richard," he said, running one hand along the fireplace mantel. "These old Lake Oswego homes hold their value incredibly well. You have any idea what it's worth on today's market?" I told him I hadn't thought about it much. "Smart," he said, nodding like I'd said something profound. "No reason to think about it. Just good to know." I filed that away somewhere I didn't look at too often. What I noticed more, what I should have paid closer attention to, was the shift in Vanessa's questions. In the beginning, she asked about me. How was I sleeping? Was I eating enough? Did I want her to come over Wednesday, or would Thursday work better? But somewhere around the end of that first year, the questions changed texture. "Dad, do you have a financial advisor you're happy with? Dad, is your will updated? Since Mom passed, some of those beneficiary designations might be outdated. Dad, where do you keep the deed to the house just so I know, in case anything ever happens?" I told myself she was being practical. Joyce had been the organized one, the one who kept the files labeled and the insurance papers in a green folder in the second drawer of the desk. Without her, Vanessa was just trying to fill a gap. I told myself that. I got very good at it. Cooper was the only part of those visits that felt completely real. He'd burst through my front door like he was rescuing the place, sneakers squeaking on the hardwood, heading straight for the kitchen to see if I had the cereal he liked. One afternoon, he stopped in front of Joyce's photo on the living room shelf. He did this sometimes like he was checking in with her, and turned to look at me with those serious eyes. "Grandpa," he said, "do you talk to Grandma still?" My throat tightened so fast it surprised me. "Yeah," I said. "I do." He nodded, satisfied. "Good," he said. "She probably likes that." Then he ran to the kitchen to find his cereal carrying no weight at all, and I stood there with my hand on the shelf, and my eyes burning, and my heart doing something complicated that I didn't have a word for. Harold Briggs, my oldest friend, came by for dinner one evening during that period, and watched Ethan work the room with the quiet attention of a man who had seen plenty of things in 63 years. After they left, Harold set down his fork and said, "That husband of hers gives me a feeling I can't quite name." "He's fine," I said. Harold looked at me the way he always did when he thought I was wrong, but knew I wasn't ready to hear it. "All right," he said, and we left it there. We shouldn't have. She called on a Tuesday. Not Sunday, which was our day. Not Saturday, which was acceptable. A Tuesday at 8:14 in the morning, while I was standing at Joyce's yellow kitchen counter eating toast and listening to the radio the way I always did, low volume, just enough to fill the quiet without pretending it wasn't there. I picked up on the second ring. "Dad?" Her voice was different. Thinner somehow, like something had been wrung out of it overnight. "I'm sorry to call so early. I didn't know who else to call." My toast went cold on the counter. "What happened? Are you okay? Is Cooper okay?" We're fine," she said quickly. "It's not like that. It's the store, Dad. We got hit with a supplier issue and we have a payment due Thursday. And if we miss it, we lose the contract, and I've been up all night trying to figure this out, and I can't." She started crying then. Not dramatically, Vanessa was too controlled for that, but the kind of quiet crying that costs something, the kind that makes your chest hurt just listening to it. "How much?" I said. $18,000. A pause. I know how that sounds. It sounded like a lot. It also sounded like my daughter, who had her mother's voice when she was scared asking for help at 8 in the morning, because she didn't know who else to call. I thought about Joyce, who had never once let me handle something hard alone. I thought about what she would have done. "Come over," I said. "We'll talk about it." Vanessa arrived an hour later, dressed simply, no jewelry, eyes still puffy from crying. She sat down across from me at the oak table in Joyce's chair, though I don't think she realized it, and she spread out some papers she'd brought in a manila folder. "Supplier contracts," she said. "Payment schedules." She walked me through the numbers with the focused energy of someone who had rehearsed this, who needed me to understand. It wasn't carelessness that had brought her here. "I hate asking you this," she said. Her hands were wrapped around the coffee mug I'd given her, knuckles pale with the grip. "Mom always said never to mix money and family. I know that. Your mother also said that family takes care of each other," I said. Vanessa's eyes filled up again. She pressed her lips together and looked down at the table, and when she looked back up, she looked so much like Joyce in that moment, the particular way Joyce had of holding herself together when she was close to falling apart, that my throat closed completely. I wrote the check. $18,000 made out to Vanessa Bennett Carr, dated the 3rd of March. I tore it from the checkbook and slid it across the table, and she took it with both hands like it was something fragile. "I'll pay you back by the end of the month," she said. "I promised Dad. 4 weeks, maybe 5. Don't worry about it," I said, because it felt wrong to talk about repayment schedules with my daughter sitting in her mother's chair, with red eyes and a manila folder full of problems. You don't draw up contracts with your daughter. That felt true to me then. It felt like something a good father would believe. She hugged me at the door for a long time before she left, her arms tight around my shoulders, her face pressed against my neck, the way she used to do when she was small, and the world had been too big for one day. "Thank you," she whispered. "I don't know what I'd do without you." I watched her car pull out of the driveway and stood there in the cold March air, feeling like I'd done something right. She called 3 weeks later. Not to say she'd paid it back, to ask if I could help with something else. I want to tell you it happened all at once. It would be a cleaner story that way. But it didn't. It happened the way water damage happens in an old building, slowly, invisibly, one small breach at a time, until the morning you press your hand against the wall and the whole thing gives. 3 weeks after the first check, Vanessa called again. The car, she said. The transmission had gone out completely, and without it she couldn't make deliveries. And without deliveries the store would fall even further behind. She was so sorry. She hated this. She just didn't have anywhere else to turn. $6,000. I told myself this is the last time. 2 months later, it was Cooper's school fees. The private elementary program they'd enrolled him in was the best in the district, she explained. And pulling him out mid-year would set him back socially and academically. $8,000. I thought about Cooper's face, those serious eyes, the way he talked to Joyce's photograph, like she could still hear him. I wrote the check before she finished the sentence. I told myself this is the last time. Then it was a roof repair. On their house in Beaverton, a contractor had found dry rot under the flashing, and if they didn't address it now, the damage would spread to the rafters. $14,000. Then a new inventory order for the online store, a chance to work with a premium supplier that would change everything. $11,000. Then Ethan's mother's funeral expenses, the flights, the arrangements, the reception. $9,000, which I later discovered his brother had already covered almost entirely. By the time I found that out, the check had been cashed for 3 months. The calls always came on Tuesdays. I started to dread Tuesdays the way I used to dread January boiler inspections, that low, cold certainty that something was going to need fixing, and the bill was going to land on my desk. Ethan was on one of those calls once in the background, talking to someone I couldn't hear. I caught only a fragment of what he said, casual and confident, like a man discussing the weather. "Don't stress about it," he said. "Dad will come through. He always does." I stood in the kitchen holding the phone against my ear and stared at the yellow wall and didn't say anything about what I'd heard. I told myself he was just being confident. I told myself a lot of things during those 3 years. What I didn't tell myself, what I refused to look at directly, was how much things had changed. Vanessa stopped asking how I was sleeping. She stopped suggesting we take a drive out to the coast the way we used to do after Joyce died, just the two of us windows down, not talking about anything important. The visits became transactional in a way I felt but couldn't name. She would arrive, sit at the oak table, explain the situation, wait for my response, leave. Sometimes she'd bring Cooper, and those visits still felt like something real. But when it was just her and Ethan, the yellow kitchen felt like a place where business got done. The summer of the 3rd year, I sat at that table on a Thursday evening, with my bank statements spread out in front of me and a calculator I'd found in Joyce's desk drawer, one of those old ones with the big buttons, her handwriting on a piece of tape across the top reading, "Kitchen Calcs." I added up every transfer, every check, every wire. $137,000. 11 transactions. 3 years. 0 repayments. Not one conversation about a repayment plan, not one mention of interest, not even the polite fiction of a payment date that both parties knew wouldn't be kept. I sat there with Joyce's calculator in my hand and the number on the page in front of me, and I thought about what she would say if she could see this kitchen right now. Not the yellow walls, not the oak table. Just me alone holding a calculator at 8 o'clock on a Thursday night, finally adding up what I'd been too afraid to count. She would have put her hand over mine. She would have said something practical and true that I wasn't ready to hear. I told myself this was love. I told myself this was what fathers do, but the number sat there on the page and didn't care what I told myself. I wasn't keeping score. That was the problem. One morning, a few weeks later, I walked into a bank branch on Southeast Hawthorne to renew a certificate of deposit, a simple errand, 40 minutes at most. A woman named Deb Morrison looked up from her computer screen, adjusted her red reading glasses, and asked me a question that changed everything. Deb Morrison had short hair, red reading glasses, and the particular stillness of someone who had learned to deliver difficult news without flinching. I remember that about her more than anything else, the stillness. The way she looked at her screen, then at me, then back at her screen, and took a breath before she spoke. "Mr. Bennett," she said, "I just want to confirm you're still comfortable with your daughter having full proxy access to your accounts." I set down the certificate of deposit paperwork I'd been holding. "I'm sorry." Deb Morrison turned her monitor slightly toward me, professional and careful, and said, "We have a proxy authorization request on file for your accounts, listed under Vanessa Bennett Carr. It would give her full management access in the event that you become—" She paused, choosing the word precisely, unable to make decisions independently. The floor didn't move, but something in my chest did. "I never filed that," I said. Deb didn't react with surprise. She simply nodded once and picked up her phone. "I'm going to ask our branch manager to come out," she said. "Is that all right?" It was not all right, but I said yes. The branch manager was a tall man named Gary, who shook my hand and walked me to a private office that smelled like carpet cleaner and artificial calm. He pulled up the filing on his computer and turned the screen toward me. A scanned document. My name at the top. My address. A photocopy of my driver's license. A signature on the bottom line that was shaped like mine but wasn't slightly too narrow in the middle, the R in Richard leaning a few degrees further than it should. My hands, I noticed, had started to tremble against my thighs. I pressed them flat against my legs to make them stop. This was submitted 2 weeks ago, Gary said. Our compliance team flagged it because the signature didn't match the one we have on file. Under the Bank Secrecy Act, we're required to report suspicious documentation activity to our compliance department. That process is already underway. Who submitted it? I asked, though I already knew. Gary looked at me with the careful expression of a man trained not to say more than necessary. The request came in by mail, he said, along with a copy of your license and a cover letter explaining that you'd asked your daughter to handle your affairs going forward. I sat with that for a moment. The carpet cleaner smell, the hum of the air conditioning, the sound of my own heartbeat doing something uncomfortable in my ears. I called Vanessa from the parking lot, standing between two cars with the winter sun flat and cold on my face. She picked up on the second ring. Dad, how are you? I just left the bank, I said. They showed me a proxy authorization filed under your name for my accounts. A pause. Not long, maybe 2 seconds, but I felt it. Oh, that, she said, and her voice shifted into something warm and slightly exasperated, like a woman explaining something obvious to someone she loved. Dad, you mentioned it at dinner a few months ago. You said if anything ever happened to you, you'd want me to be able to handle things. I was just trying to be proactive. I should have told you I'm sorry I thought you knew. I did not remember saying that at dinner. I searched back through every meal we'd shared in the past 6 months and found nothing that resembled that conversation. But here is the thing about doubt: when it comes to someone you love, it turns on you before it turns on them. Maybe I had said it. Maybe I'd been tired and distracted, and the words had come out without landing in my memory. Joyce used to say I could hold a conversation and be somewhere else entirely at the same time. Okay, I said. Just let me know before you do something like that again. Of course, Vanessa said. Of course, Dad. I love you. I drove home with the windows down despite the cold, the air sharp against my face, trying to clear something that wouldn't clear. I sat at Joyce's kitchen table for a long time without taking off my coat. I looked at her photograph on the shelf. I looked at the yellow walls she had painted with her own hands. Then I picked up the phone again and called a different number. 6 days later, a letter arrived in the mailbox. A collection notice for a business loan of $190,000 in my name. I had never borrowed that money. There are moments in a life that divide everything into before and after. I've had a few. The day I married Joyce. The day Vanessa was born. The morning the hospital called. And now this, standing at the mailbox on a Tuesday afternoon in August, holding a single envelope with a return address I didn't recognize, feeling the particular weight of something that hasn't broken yet, but is about to. I opened it at Joyce's table. The letter was from a financial services company called Meridian Capital Group, based out of Phoenix, Arizona. It informed me in the careful language of people who do this for a living that a business loan in the amount of $190,000 issued 14 months prior under the name Richard Allen Bennett was now 93 days past due. That penalties and interest had been accruing. That if I did not contact them within 15 business days, the matter would be referred to a collections agency and reported to all 3 major credit bureaus. My name, my address, my date of birth. A loan I had never applied for, never signed for, never received a single dollar from. I read it twice. Then I picked up the phone and called the number at the bottom of the page. The representative who answered was polite and thorough. He told me the loan had been applied for online using a scanned copy of my Oregon driver's license, my social security number, and an email address registered under my name, Richard Bennett 1964, work@gmail.com, that I had never created. The funds had been deposited into a business checking account, belonging to a company called Pacific Crest Distribution, LLC. I had never heard of Pacific Crest Distribution, LLC. I asked who had registered it. The representative said he wasn't able to share that information, but suggested I file a report with the Federal Trade Commission and contact my state's Attorney General office regarding potential identity theft. I thanked him. I hung up. I sat at Joyce's table with both hands flat on the wood and stared at the yellow wall in front of me until the color stopped meaning anything. Then I did what Joyce always told me to do when something was too big to carry alone. I called someone who knew what they were doing. Caroline Webb had handled our family's legal matters for 11 years, our wills, the property deed, a boundary dispute with a neighbor in 2017 that had gotten more complicated than it needed to. She had an office on Southwest Broadway 2nd floor, with a window that looked out over a small courtyard where someone had planted rose bushes that never quite bloomed. I had always liked that about her office. It felt honest. She was at her desk when I arrived, and she stood up when I walked in and shook my hand the way she always did, firm, brief, no theater. She was 58 years old, with silver hair she kept pulled back, and reading glasses on a chain around her neck, and she had a way of listening that made you feel like every word you said was being carefully filed somewhere important. I told her everything. The proxy authorization at the bank, the phone call with Vanessa, the letter, the loan, the email address I'd never created. I laid the papers on her desk in the order I'd received them and watched her read each one without interrupting me. When I finished, she put down her pen. "Before we do anything else," she said, "I need you to check your credit report. All 3 bureaus, Equifax, Experian, TransUnion. You can pull them through annualcreditreport.com, which is the only federally authorized source. If someone has been using your identity, there may be other accounts you don't know about yet." I pulled out my phone right there in her office and did it. It took 12 minutes. When the results loaded, my stomach dropped the way it does when an elevator moves faster than you expect. There were 2 additional accounts. A credit card opened 8 months ago with a $6,000 limit maxed out within 30 days, and a second business line of credit for $22,000 issued to a company called Cascade Beauty Imports, another name I had never heard. Caroline looked at the screen over my shoulder and didn't say anything dramatic. She just nodded once slowly, like someone confirming a diagnosis they'd already suspected. "Richard," she said, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear it clearly." She sat back down across from me and folded her hands on the desk. "Do not confront Vanessa. Not yet. Not until we know exactly what we're dealing with and have documentation that can't be disputed. If she knows you're aware of this before we're ready, evidence disappears, accounts get closed, stories get coordinated." My jaw tightened so hard my back teeth ached. "She's my daughter," I said, and I hated how much I still meant it. "I know," Caroline said. Her voice was not unkind. "That's exactly why we have to do this right." She walked me to the door 40 minutes later with a list of things I needed to do, and a name she wanted me to remember, Frank Delgado, a former financial crimes investigator she trusted completely. I drove back to Lake Oswego in the early evening, the sun going orange over the West Hills, and walked into my kitchen and stood at the counter and looked at the yellow walls and thought about Joyce painting them one slow roller stroke at a time, absolutely certain about the color she wanted. The hardest thing I have ever done, harder than burying my wife, harder than anything I have faced in 60 years of living, was put that letter in a drawer, sit down at her table, and act like nothing had changed. She asked me 3 questions before we started. The first 2 were professional. Had I changed all my passwords, email, banking, investment accounts? Had I made copies of every document related to the loan and the proxy filing, and kept them somewhere outside the house? I said yes to both. The third question she asked differently. She set down her pen, took off her reading glasses, and looked at me directly across the desk, the way people rarely do anymore, like she actually wanted to hear the answer. "Richard," she said, "what do you want the rest of your life to look like?" The question hit me somewhere I wasn't prepared for. I opened my mouth and closed it again. Outside the window, the rose bushes in the courtyard were doing their usual unconvincing thing, a few pale blooms hanging on despite the August heat. Nobody had asked me that since Joyce died. Not once in 3 years. I thought about it for a long moment, and Caroline let me think without filling the space, which I appreciated more than I could say. "I want to travel," I finally said. Joyce and I had a list, places we kept saying we'd get to: Portugal, the Oregon coast in November when the tourists are gone, Rocky Mountain National Park in October when the elk are running. My voice did something embarrassing on the word elk, and I cleared my throat and pushed through it. "I want to wake up on a Tuesday morning and not feel my stomach drop when my phone rings. I want to feel like this life, whatever's left of it, belongs to me." Caroline looked at me for a moment. Then she picked up her pen and wrote something down. "Then that's what we're working toward," she said. She introduced Frank Delgado 20 minutes later. He came in from the small conference room off the hallway, a compact man in his early 50s with close-cropped gray hair and the unhurried movements of someone who had spent decades watching people lie and had stopped being surprised by it. He shook my hand, once sat down, and opened a slim folder without preamble. "I've already started pulling financial records associated with Pacific Crest Distribution and Cascade Beauty Imports," he said. "Give me 2 weeks, and I'll know exactly where your money went and who touched it." "You think it leads back to Vanessa?" I said. Frank looked at me with steady, dark eyes. "I think it leads somewhere specific," he said carefully. "And I think you already know where." He was right. I did know. I just hadn't wanted to say it out loud in a lawyer's office on a Wednesday afternoon because saying it out loud made it real in a way I wasn't ready for. Caroline walked me to the elevator afterward and said, "Keep your routine exactly the same. Visit with Vanessa when she asks. Answer her calls. Don't change anything she can notice." "For how long?" I asked. "Until we're ready," she said. "And Richard." She put one hand briefly on my arm the way Joyce used to when she wanted me to actually hear something. "Write down that list, the places you and Joyce wanted to go. Put it somewhere you can see it. You're going to need to remember what you're doing this for." That evening I found an old paper napkin in the kitchen junk drawer, the kind from a diner, thin and slightly waxy, and I wrote down every place Joyce and I had ever talked about visiting. Portugal, Nova Scotia, the Colorado Rockies in October. 7 places in all in my handwriting on one side. I left the other side blank. I folded it and put it in the nightstand drawer under the shoebox of sticky notes. Then I went to bed and lay in the dark and thought about elk in October and tried to remember what hope felt like. A few days later, Harold Briggs showed up at my door with a 6-pack of Deschutes Brewery Black Butte Porter and a look on his face I hadn't seen before. The look of a man who had been carrying something for too long and had finally decided to put it down. Harold Briggs had been my friend for 40 years, which meant he had exactly one way of delivering bad news straight at you, no warning, like pulling off a bandage. He sat down at Joyce's table, set the 6-pack between us without opening one, and said, "Richard, I need to ask you something, and I need you to not get defensive before I finish." "That's a terrible way to start a conversation," I said. "I know." He folded his hands on the table. "Are you in financial trouble?" I stared at him. "What?" Harold exhaled through his nose the sound he made when something had been bothering him for longer than was comfortable. "Vanessa came by Sandra's place 2 weeks ago. I happened to be there. She told Sandra and Pastor Dale, And from what I can tell, half the people at the Thursday morning farmers market, that you'd lost most of your retirement savings on bad investments, that you were too proud to ask for help. He paused. She said she and Ethan have been covering your groceries and utility bills for the past several months. The room didn't spin, but something behind my eyes went very hot, very fast. She said what? My voice came out lower than I intended, scraped thin against something I didn't have a name for yet. She said you'd made some poor decisions, and that the family was quietly supporting you. Harold looked at me steadily, the way he always did when he was telling me something I didn't want to hear. She said you were too stubborn to admit it, that you'd be embarrassed if people knew. He leaned forward slightly. Richard Laurie Simmons repeated it to 3 people at her book club. Sandra cried because she felt bad for not noticing sooner. Pastor Dale called Vanessa afterward to tell her what a good daughter she was. I pushed my chair back from the table and stood up. Not because I was leaving, I just couldn't sit still with what was moving through my chest. I walked to the counter and stood there with both hands gripping the edge of it, looking at the yellow wall, feeling something that wasn't quite anger yet, but was building toward it the way a storm builds pressure first, then everything else. She's been building a case, I said mostly to myself. What does that mean? I turned around. Harold was watching me with the focused attention of a man who had known me long enough to understand when I was about to say something important. It means if I ever push back, if I ever question anything she's done, everyone around me already believes I'm the one who can't manage his own affairs. My voice was steady, but my hands were not. I gripped the counter harder. She gets to be the responsible one, the devoted daughter who gave up her time and money for her struggling father. And I get to be the old man who doesn't know what day it is. Harold was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How bad is it actually, Richard?" The money. I went to the kitchen drawer where I'd been keeping the bank statements. I'd pulled them all 3 years' worth after the meeting with Caroline, and I spread them out on the table between us. I found the notepad I'd been using and slid it toward Harold so he could see the number I'd written at the bottom. $137,000. Harold looked at the number for a long time. His jaw tightened. He picked up one of the porters, opened it, and took a long, slow drink before he set it back down. "Not $1 back," he said. "Not one. And you never pushed for it." I told myself it was love, I said. The words tasted like something that had gone bad slowly over time without me noticing until it was already rotten. I told myself that's what fathers do. Harold looked at me with an expression I'd seen on his face only a handful of times in 4 decades. The expression of a man who is furious on behalf of someone he loves and is working very hard to keep that fury useful rather than just loud. "You remember 2 years ago," he said slowly, "when I told you something felt off about Ethan?" The question landed in my chest like a stone dropping into still water. "I remember," I said. "You told me I was reading too much into things." "I know. I should have pushed harder," Harold said. "That's on me too." We sat there at Joyce's table with the bank statements between us and the beer going warm and the yellow walls holding the last of the evening light. And I felt something shift in me, not a decision exactly, but the thing that comes just before a decision. The moment when you stop telling yourself the story you've been telling and start looking at what's actually there. "What are you going to do?" Harold asked. I thought about Caroline's office, Frank Delgado's steady dark eyes, the napkin in my nightstand drawer with 7 places written on it in my own handwriting. "I'm going to finish it," I said. What I didn't know yet, what I was about to find out the next time Vanessa came to visit, was that she had been filming me. The thing about watching someone watch you is that it changes everything. I had spent 3 years not paying close enough attention. Now I paid attention to everything: the angle of Vanessa's phone when she set it on the counter, the way her eyes moved to it whenever I reached for something slowly, or paused mid-sentence to find a word. I noticed the things I hadn't let myself notice before, and once I started, I could not stop. She came over on a Wednesday afternoon in early October, which was unusual. Vanessa was a creature of routine: Sundays for visits, Tuesdays for requests. A Wednesday meant something had shifted in her timeline, though she arrived with a container of chicken soup and a smile that could have convinced anyone watching that she was simply a good daughter checking on her father. "You look tired, Dad," she said, setting the soup on the counter. "Have you been sleeping okay? Any dizziness lately? Headaches?" "I'm fine," I said. "I read that men your age sometimes experience balance issues without realizing it." She was already moving through the kitchen, straightening things that didn't need straightening, her phone face up on the counter, at an angle that pointed toward the table where I was sitting. "Have you had any moments where you just lost your train of thought? Couldn't remember where you'd put something?" "Vanessa," I said, "I'm 60 years old, not 90. She laughed, bright, warm, completely convincing. I know. I just worry." I picked up my coffee mug deliberately with both hands and said clearly and loudly, "I slept 8 hours last night. I made eggs this morning. I read the paper. I am perfectly fine." Her phone screen went dark. She picked it up and slipped it into her pocket. 20 minutes later, I mentioned offhandedly that my knee had been bothering me, an old injury from a fall on a job site in 2009, nothing new, nothing significant. Her phone was out again within 30 seconds, propped against the fruit bowl, the little red recording light barely visible from across the room. So that was how it worked. She needed footage of me being confused, being slow, being diminished. She was building a portrait of a man in decline, frame by careful frame, cutting out every moment I was sharp and keeping every moment I wasn't. I thought about all the times in the past year she'd caught me mid-yawn or mid-stumble or searching for a word, all the completely ordinary moments of being a 60-year-old human being, and understood that she had been assembling them into something that told a very specific story. A story where she was the only responsible adult left in my life. I didn't say any of this. I finished my coffee. I asked about Cooper. She told me he'd lost a tooth and was deeply invested in negotiating the tooth fairy's going rate, which apparently had gone up significantly since she was a child. I laughed at that, a real laugh, because Cooper was genuinely funny, and watched her decide not to film the laugh. She left around 4 o'clock. I walked her to the door, hugged her the way I always did, told her the soup smelled wonderful. She drove away, and I stood on the porch until her car turned the corner, and then I sat down on the front steps in the October cold and pressed my hands against my face and breathed. Cooper came around the side of the house 20 minutes later. He'd been dropped off by Ethan, apparently to spend the afternoon, a detail Vanessa had mentioned only as she was leaving, casually, like an afterthought. He came through the side gate at full speed, sneakers slapping the flagstones, a drawing rolled up in his fist. "Grandpa!" He skidded to a stop in front of me, breathing hard, holding out the drawing. "I made this at school. My teacher said it was the best rocket ship she'd ever seen." I unrolled it. It was a rocket ship rendered in red and orange crayon flames, shooting from the bottom, a small figure visible in the window at the top. The figure had yellow hair and was waving. "Is that the pilot?" I asked. "That's you," Cooper said, completely serious. "You're going to space." My throat closed up so fast it hurt. I looked at this boy, 8 years old, gap-toothed sneakers that lit up when he walked, absolutely certain that his grandfather was going to space, and felt something move through my chest that I can only describe as the specific pain of loving someone so much that protecting them feels like the only thing that matters. That was it. That was the answer to the question I'd been carrying since Caroline asked me what I wanted the rest of my life to look like. Not the travel, not the napkin list, not even the yellow kitchen. It was this: Cooper handing me a drawing in the October cold, completely trusting, completely unaware of what the adults around him had been doing. His future, whatever small part of it I could shape from where I stood, was worth every difficult thing that was coming. "It's the best rocket ship I've ever seen," I told him, and meant it completely. He beamed so wide I could count every missing tooth, then grabbed my hand and pulled me inside to find something to eat, chattering about the tooth fairy, the whole way his sneakers flashing with every step. That night, long after Cooper had gone home and the house had settled into its particular evening quiet, I picked up my phone and called Harold. He answered on the second ring. "You okay?" he said. I thought about Vanessa's phone on the counter. I thought about Cooper's rocket ship, now folded carefully, and sitting on my nightstand, next to the napkin list. I thought about Joyce, who had always said that the people worth fighting for are the ones who don't know you're fighting for them yet. "Not yet," I said, "but I'm going to be." 3 days later, I woke up face down on the kitchen table with no memory of falling asleep, and a half-full cup of tea Vanessa had brought me the previous afternoon, sitting cold beside my hand. Before I reveal what the lab results actually showed, comment, "Still here, so I know you haven't left." Because what I'm about to tell you is the detail that made everything else make sense. Some elements of this story are fictional, included for educational and entertainment purposes. If stories like this aren't what you're looking for, no hard feelings. This is your moment to choose. I have spent 40 years diagnosing problems in buildings that couldn't tell me what was wrong with them. A boiler that shuts off at 2 in the morning. A ventilation system that moves air incorrectly in only one wing of a school. A water heater that works perfectly on cold days and fails on warm ones. You learn after enough years that the answer is always in the details, the small things that don't fit the pattern, the things that are almost right, but not quite. I woke up face down on the kitchen table on a Thursday morning in October, with a crick in my neck and a heaviness in my head that felt different from tiredness. Not the dull weight of a poor night's sleep. Something denser. Something that sat behind my eyes and pressed outward. The cold cup of tea Vanessa had brought me the previous afternoon was still on the table beside my hand, half finished, the surface filmed over with the particular stillness of something that had been sitting too long. I looked at that cup for a while. Then I went to the bathroom and looked at my pill organizer, the one Joyce had bought me years ago, 7 compartments, one for each day, because she said I had the memory of a very intelligent golden retriever when it came to medication. My blood pressure pills. 1 in the morning, 1 at night, prescribed by my doctor for the past 6 years, managed and stable. I picked up Thursday's compartment and tipped the contents into my palm. 2 of the 4 pills looked exactly right. The other 2 were slightly different, not dramatically, not in a way that would catch your eye if you weren't looking for it. A shade paler. The coating had a slightly different texture under my thumbnail when I pressed it. Almost identical. Almost. I am a man who has spent his career noticing almost. I did not call Vanessa. I did not call Caroline. I got in my car and drove to a private testing lab on Northeast Sandy Boulevard that I had looked up 2 nights earlier after the first time I'd woken up feeling wrong when I'd told myself I was being paranoid and almost convinced myself it was true. I walked in with the pills in a small Ziploc bag and told the technician I needed a composition analysis and asked how long it would take. 3 days, she said. I said I'd pay extra for 2. I spent those 2 days moving through my normal routines with the particular focus of a man who has decided to treat everything as evidence. I did not take my evening pills. I told myself I was being careful. I told myself I might be wrong. But I left the pill organizer exactly where it was, exactly as it looked, and I waited. The results came back on a Saturday morning. The technician called me at 8:47. She read me the findings in the flat professional tone of someone reporting data rather than meaning, but the meaning was there in every word. 2 of the 4 pills contained a compound not consistent with my prescribed blood pressure medication. The compound was identified as a low-dose sedative, specifically a benzodiazepine derivative, the kind used in mild anxiety and sleep medications. Not dangerous in a single dose. Not dramatic. But taken regularly over weeks or months, it would produce dizziness, fatigue, cognitive sluggishness, and occasional disorientation, symptoms that could very easily be described as the early stages of cognitive decline. I thanked her. I hung up. I sat in Joyce's yellow kitchen and pressed both palms flat against the table and looked at the wall and felt something move through me that I can only describe as a door closing quietly permanently on something I had been trying to keep open. I called Caroline. She called Dr. Ellen Walsh before I'd finished explaining. Dr. Ellen Walsh had her practice on Southwest Corbett Avenue, a clean, unhurried office with good light and plants that actually looked healthy, which I had always taken as a sign of someone who paid attention to the things in their care. She was 49 years old, with close-cropped dark hair and the calm, precise manner of someone who chose her words, the way a surgeon chooses instruments deliberately, with full awareness of what each one could do. She listened to everything I told her without interrupting. When I finished, she leaned forward with her elbows on the desk. "I need you to repeat the test at a CLIA-certified laboratory," she said. A Clinical Laboratory Improvement Amendments certified facility, that's the federal standard for labs, whose results are admissible in legal proceedings. The private lab gave us a direction. The certified lab gives us a weapon. She made the referral herself, called in a favor with the lab director, and had me there by 2 in the afternoon. The results, when they came back 48 hours later, confirmed everything the first test had found documented, certified legally admissible. Dr. Walsh called me with the results on a Monday evening. I was standing in the kitchen. The yellow walls were going amber in the late light, the way they did every evening around 6, and I remember thinking that Joyce would have loved this particular hour in this particular room, and that I was standing in it alone because someone had decided my confusion was worth more than my clarity. "Richard," Dr. Walsh said, "what's been done to your medication constitutes criminal tampering under Oregon law. This isn't a civil matter. This is a crime." She paused, and her voice was careful but firm. "I want you to know that I will testify to these findings in any proceeding that requires it. Whatever you decide to do next, you have the documentation to support it." I thanked her. I set the phone down on the counter. I stood there in Joyce's kitchen for a long time, in the amber light, with my hands pressed flat on the counter, and my jaw so tight my back teeth ached, and something burning behind my eyes that I refused to let become tears, because I was done crying about this. I was done being the person things happened to. I picked up the phone and called Caroline. "She wasn't just trying to take my house," I said when she answered. "She was trying to take me." Caroline didn't say anything soothing. She didn't offer comfort designed to soften what was true. She said, "I know, which is why what we do next has to be exactly right." A beat. "Then I'm calling Frank. It's time to stop playing defense." Frank Delgado put a folder on the table and said, "I need you to hear all of it before you react." I had been in enough difficult meetings in my career to know that when someone opens with that sentence, what follows is going to be bad. I nodded. I folded my hands in my lap. I made myself breathe at a normal rate. Frank opened the folder. Vanessa's online retail business, Pacific Crest Beauty, doing business under 3 different names across various platforms, was issued a cease and desist by the Oregon Department of Justice 8 months ago for selling counterfeit goods misrepresented as premium imported products. He slid a document across the table. The fine was $86,000. The inventory was seized. There's an ongoing federal investigation under the Trademark Counterfeiting Act because some of the goods crossed state lines. I looked at the document. My daughter's name was on it in black ink in the particular font of official government correspondence next to the word respondent. "Keep going," I said. Frank turned a page. "Ethan Carr has outstanding gambling debts totaling approximately $260,000 across 4 creditors, 2 offshore sports betting platforms, 1 private poker network, and a loan shark operating out of Vancouver, Washington, who has made 2 in-person visits to their home in the past 6 weeks." He said this with the same tone he might use to read a grocery list, which somehow made it worse. He has liquidated his 401k, maxed out 2 personal credit cards, and taken out a second mortgage on the Beaverton property without Vanessa's knowledge, or so she has told the creditors when they've called. Caroline made a note on her legal pad. I watched her pen move and thought about Ethan sitting at my kitchen table all those Sunday afternoons, pleasant and well-dressed, asking polite questions about the neighborhood. "The loan shark," I said. "The man from Vancouver." "His name is not something you need to know," Frank said. "What you need to know is that Ethan is out of time and out of options, and he knows it." He turned another page. "Vanessa has contacted 3 separate real estate brokers in the past 2 months regarding your property on Wisteria Lane." Frank slid 3 printed emails across the table, inquiry forms, each one signed with Vanessa's name, each one describing the property as belonging to an elderly family member who would be transitioning to long-term care. In each inquiry, Wamoshi stated that she expected to have power of attorney within 30 days and asked for a preliminary market valuation. He tapped the top email with one finger. "The house is worth between $1.3 and $1.5 million on today's market. That's enough to cover their combined debts with enough left over to rebuild." The room was very quiet. Outside the window, the rose bushes were doing their unconvincing thing, a single pale bloom hanging on in the November cold. I picked up the first email and read it. Then I read it again. "Elderly family member transitioning to long-term care." I had coached my daughter's soccer team when she was 9 years old. I had sat with her through 2 broken hearts and 1 broken collarbone. I had held her hand in the hospital waiting room when Cooper was born. Both of us too scared to talk, and when the nurse came out and said everything was fine, Vanessa had grabbed my arm so hard she left marks. And now I was elderly family member transitioning to long-term care. Something cracked open in my chest, not dramatically, not with noise, but the way old concrete cracks in a hard freeze, quietly, and all the way through. "There's one more thing," Frank said. He slid a final document across the table. It was a printed screenshot, a text message thread, between a number registered to Vanessa Bennett Carr and a number registered to a facility called Cascadia Recovery and Wellness Center in Salem, Oregon. The messages were from 6 weeks ago. "Patient will present as resistant and possibly confused," Vanessa had written. "He has a history of paranoid ideation and has been making financial decisions that concern the family. I'll have documentation from his physician. We can accommodate," came the reply. "Standard evaluation hold is 72 hours, extendable to 7 days with appropriate paperwork." "That should be sufficient," Vanessa had written back. My hands had started shaking before I reached the end of the message. Not the small tremor of cold or tiredness, a deep involuntary shaking that started in my fingers and moved up through my wrists and forearms and didn't stop when I pressed my palms flat against the table. "She planned this," I said. My voice came out wrong, too thin, too high, scraped against something raw inside my throat. "She planned all of it. The videos, the medication, the facility. She's been building toward this for months." "Yes," Frank said simply. I looked at Caroline. She was watching me with steady gray eyes and an expression that was not pity. Caroline Webb did not do pity, but something closer to the particular respect you give a person who is holding themselves together under circumstances that would have broken someone less stubborn. "How long?" I asked her. "How long has she been planning this?" Caroline was quiet for a moment. "Based on the timeline Frank's established," she said carefully, "we believe the active planning began approximately 8 months ago, around the time the business fine was issued and Ethan's debt reached its current level." She paused. "But Richard, the groundwork, the relationship she built with your neighbors, the image she constructed on social media, the financial dependency she created over 3 years." She held my gaze. "That started much earlier." The words landed in my stomach like cold water. I thought about Cooper's rocket ship on my nightstand. I thought about the napkin list in the drawer beside it. I thought about Joyce painting the kitchen walls one careful stroke at a time, absolutely certain about the color she wanted, and how she used to say that the most important thing in any difficult job was to know exactly what you were working toward before you picked up the first tool. I knew what I was working toward. "Tell me what we need," I said to Frank. He almost smiled. It was a small thing, a fraction of a degree at one corner of his mouth, but from Frank Delgado it was practically a standing ovation. "3 things," he said. "Cameras, documentation, and patience." 3 nights later, I came home earlier than expected. Vanessa's car was in the driveway. The garage light was on, and through the side window I could hear them talking. Frank had texted me at 4:53 in the afternoon, "V&E at your place. Garage." I had been at the hardware store on Burnside picking up weather stripping for the back door, the kind of ordinary errand that feels strange when you know your life is no longer ordinary. I drove home the long way, parked 2 houses down, and walked up the side of the property, through the neighbor's hedge, the way I used to cut through as a kid before I was old enough to know about property lines. The garage side door was cracked open an inch. Through it, I could hear Vanessa's voice. Not the voice she used with me. That was the first thing that hit me, how completely different she sounded. The warmth was gone. The careful softness, the practiced concern, all of it stripped away, and what was underneath was something flat and efficient and entirely focused on logistics. 7 days is the window, she was saying. Once he's checked in, the facility holds him for the initial evaluation period. That gives us enough time to clear the house and get the listing up. Ethan's voice tighter and higher than usual. "What if he refuses to sign the intake forms?" "He won't. The medication will have him foggy enough that he'll sign whatever I put in front of him." A pause. "I've already sent them the videos. They're expecting a man who can't manage his own affairs. By the time he's clear-headed enough to argue, it'll be documented that he had an episode." My back was against the outside wall of my own garage. The December air was sharp and cold and smelled like wood smoke from somewhere down the street. I pressed one hand flat against the siding I had replaced myself in 2018, standing on a ladder in August heat, while Joyce brought me lemonade and told me I was doing it wrong, and I made myself stay completely still. "What about the stuff from the investigation?" Ethan said. "The inventory. It goes in the garage here." Vanessa's voice was patient, the tone of someone who has explained something multiple times. "All of it. The product, the shipping materials, the label printer. If the investigators come back and trace it here, it looks like Dad was running the operation. I've got a paper trail that puts his email address on 2 supplier contracts." Ethan made a sound, not quite a word, somewhere between a breath and a groan. "And you think that'll hold up?" "I think it creates enough confusion that nobody's looking at me." Another pause. "Ethan, we are out of time. The Vancouver guy called again this morning. We don't have another option." I had heard enough. I walked back down the side of the property the same way I'd come, slowly and quietly, and got in my car and drove 3 blocks before I pulled over. My hands were shaking so badly I couldn't have managed the wheel anyway. I gripped it with both hands and pressed my forehead against the leather and breathed through my nose until the shaking slowed. This was my daughter. This was the woman who had sobbed into my shoulder the morning after Joyce died, who had sat across from me at the yellow kitchen table and cried real tears and said, "I don't know what I'd do without you." This was the woman whose voice I had heard through a baby monitor for the first 3 years of her life, who had fallen asleep in the back seat of our old Subaru on the way home from every beach trip we'd ever taken, her cheek pressed against the window, entirely trusting, entirely safe. I had raised her. I had loved her completely, and she had looked at all of that love and decided it was a resource. My eyes were burning so badly, I had to close them. I sat in the dark behind my own eyelids and felt something break in a place that doesn't have a name, not anger, not grief exactly, but the specific devastation of understanding that someone you built your life around has been measuring the distance between your love and your limits for years. I sat there until the shaking stopped. Then I called Caroline. "It's time," I said when she answered. "I'm ready to finish this." She didn't ask what I'd heard. She said, "I'll call Frank. Come in tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock. Bring coffee." I drove home through the December dark and walked into Joyce's yellow kitchen and sat down at the oak table and did not turn on the lights. I just sat in the dark with my sant flat on the wood and let myself feel the full weight of it, all of it, every dollar, every Tuesday, phone call, every careful lie, until it passed through me like a wave passes through something that has decided not to break. At 2 in the morning, I went to bed. I did not sleep, but I knew exactly what I was going to do. Caroline had a pot of coffee waiting when I walked in at 9 o'clock. She poured 2 cups without asking how I took mine she'd known for 11 years and set one in front of me and said, "Tell me everything you heard. Word for word, as close as you can get." I told her. She wrote it down without interrupting her pen, moving in the small, precise script she'd had for as long as I'd known her. When I finished, she set the pen down and looked at what she'd written for a moment. "All right," she said. "Here's what we're going to do." What followed was the most focused 2 hours I had spent since Joyce died. Frank arrived at 10 with a canvas bag that clinked when he set it on the conference table. 4 small wireless cameras, each one no larger than a matchbox, each one capable of streaming directly to a secure server he monitored remotely. He spread them out on the table and walked me through the placement. One in the garage above the storage shelves angled down. One in the home office behind the clock on the bookshelf. One in the hallway covering the approach to the front door. One at the back entry covering the kitchen and the door to the garage simultaneously. "I'll install them while Vanessa's not in Portland," Frank said. "You tell her you need a week to yourself. Make it sound like grief. She'll understand grief. It's a useful emotion when you need someone to give you space." I told Vanessa that afternoon. I called her and said I was having a hard week, that the anniversary of Joyce's passing was coming up, and I needed some time alone. My voice did not have to work very hard to sound convincing, because it was true that I was having a hard week, just not for the reason I gave. Vanessa said, of course she completely understood. She would check in by text and give me my space. Her voice was warm and full of concern. I thanked her and hung up and stood in the kitchen for a moment, looking at the yellow walls, thinking about what it costs to become fluent in someone else's language of deception. Frank installed the cameras on a Thursday while I ran errands across town. By Friday morning, everything he and I saw in that house was being recorded and backed up to a server in a facility in Hillsboro, Oregon, with a timestamp on every frame. The legal work moved in parallel. Caroline had already begun the paperwork 3 weeks earlier, on the morning after I'd first heard the text messages from Cascadia. The Joyce Bennett Memorial Trust was a revocable living trust established under Oregon revised statutes. Chapter 130, which meant I transferred the deed of the Wisteria Lane property directly into the trust while I was still alive, still competent, and still entirely in control. Once the deed is in the trust, Caroline explained, spreading the documents across her desk, Vanessa cannot sell it, cannot mortgage it, and cannot take possession of it under any power of attorney because the property no longer belongs to you as an individual. It belongs to the trust, and the trust has a successor trustee who is not her. Who is the successor trustee? I asked. I am, Caroline said, until you direct otherwise. I signed the documents. Caroline notarized them. The deed transfer was recorded with the Clackamas County Clerk's office on a Tuesday morning, which felt appropriate. That same week, Frank compiled every piece of evidence gathered to date the bank proxy, filing the credit report. Damaged the loan documentation, the text messages with Cascadia, the certified lab results from Dr. Walsh, the real estate broker inquiries, and delivered certified copies to 2 special agents with the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit in Portland. He retained the originals in a secure facility, chain of custody, he explained, when I asked why 2 sets. If this goes to trial, and I believe it will, every piece of evidence needs to be traceable from the moment it was collected to the moment it's presented in court. The copies you have, the copies. The agents have the originals. I hold every link in that chain needs to be documented and unbroken. I understood chains. I had spent 40 years maintaining systems where a single weak link could bring down an entire structure. I drove to the house on a Friday afternoon and went through every room slowly, the way you do when you're saying goodbye to something. I stood in the yellow kitchen for a long time. I looked at the oak table, the window over the sink, the place on the wall where Joyce had written Cooper's height every birthday with a pencil, and the year beside it, the marks still there from age 3 through age 7 before they'd moved to Beaverton. Then I went to my office, opened the small safe behind the bookshelf, and placed an envelope inside. On the front of the envelope, in my handwriting, I had written one line. Were you looking for this? Inside the envelope was a blank piece of paper. I closed the safe and spun the dial. That evening, I walked to the neighborhood church, where Joyce and I had spent a lot of Sunday mornings over the years. Pastor Dale Whitmore was locking up the side door when I came up the front path, and he stopped and looked at me for a moment with the particular attention of a man who has spent 50 years reading people's faces. Richard, he said, you look different. I feel different, I said. He studied me a moment longer. Good different or bad different? I thought about it honestly. Both, I said. I think both. He nodded slowly, the way he did when he was filing something away for later. You know where I am if you need me, he said. I thanked him and walked home through the December evening with my hands in my pockets and the cold air sharp in my lungs, and for the first time in months, I felt something that was almost like steadiness. Not happiness, not relief. Just the particular calm of a man who has made his decisions and is now simply waiting for the right moment to act on them. 2 weeks later, Vanessa called to say she'd noticed I seemed more tired than usual. She had an idea, she said, a place she'd heard about just a few days just to get checked out. She said it with so much warmth in her voice that I almost forgot I was the one who had set the table. Vanessa organized my 60th birthday party at a rented event room at the Oswego Lake Country Club, neutral ground, she called it, which I thought was an interesting choice of words. Balloons. A catered spread from a Mediterranean place in Lake Oswego she knew I liked. A cake with Happy 60th Dad written in navy blue frosting, because she remembered that was my favorite color. Sandra Kowalski came with tulips from her garden, even though it was January, and I have no idea how she managed tulips in January. Pastor Dale shook my hand and said 60 was just the opening act. Harold stood in the corner with a plate of food he wasn't eating, watching everything the way Harold always watched everything, like a man reading a book he'd already guessed the ending of. I went because I wanted to see her face when I said it. The evening moved the way these things do, toasts, old stories, people laughing at things that weren't quite as funny as they pretended. Vanessa moved through the room like someone who had choreographed it, touching shoulders, refilling glasses, laughing at exactly the right moments. She was good at this. She had always been good at this. Around 9 o'clock, when the crowd had thinned to a handful of people and the caterers were beginning to stack plates, Vanessa appeared at my elbow. She steered me gently toward the far end of the room with one hand on my arm, the way you move someone when you want the conversation to be private. "Dad," she said, her voice dropping to the register she used when she wanted something to sound like it was coming from her heart. "Ethan and I have been talking. With the kids getting older and our place getting tight, we've been thinking about the house, about what makes sense for everyone going forward." I set my glass down on the table beside me. I looked at her, really looked at her the way I hadn't let myself look in months, because looking meant seeing, and seeing meant knowing, and knowing meant that everything I'd been telling myself for 3 years was finished. She was my daughter. She had her mother's chin and Joyce's way of tilting her head slightly when she was waiting for an answer. "I sold it, Vanessa," I said. The color left her face so fast, it was like watching a light switch off. "You..." Her voice broke on the word. "What?" "The deed transferred out of my name in March. I've been renting a 2-bedroom in Eastmoreland. Good light. Quiet street. Walking distance to the park where your mother and I used to go on Sundays." She stared at me. Her lips parted and closed and parted again, and nothing came out. Across the room, Ethan had gone very still. Harold from his corner caught my eye and gave the smallest nod I have ever seen a human being give. Vanessa excused herself 30 seconds later, crossed the room to Ethan, and the two of them moved toward the door with the controlled urgency of people trying very hard not to look like they were running. 4 days later, Caroline called me. "Their attorney contacted us this morning," she said. "Questions about the validity of recent asset transfers." She paused. "Right on schedule." The following Tuesday, Vanessa called to say she was worried about me. The party had been wonderful, but I'd seemed tired, she said. Had I been dizzy at all? There was a place in Salem, a wellness center, really very calm, very professional, that a friend had recommended. Just a few days, just to get everything checked out. I told her I wasn't sure. She drove over that evening and sat across from me at the oak table and took my hand in both of hers, and her eyes filled up and her voice went soft. And she said, "Dad, I already lost Mom. I can't do this again. I can't lose you too." I looked at my daughter's face. I thought about the garage. I thought about elderly family member transitioning to long-term care. I thought about Cooper's rocket ship on my nightstand and the napkin list in the drawer beside it. "Okay," I said, "if it'll make you feel better." She held my hand the whole drive to Salem. 2 hours through the January dark, the Willamette Valley flat and quiet on either side of the highway. I looked out the window and thought about Joyce and about October in the Rockies and about elk moving through aspen trees in the early morning, their breath visible in the cold. Outside, Pastor Dale had been walking to his car when we'd left. He'd raised a hand in farewell. His eyes had stayed on my face a full second longer than a wave requires. I think he knew something had shifted. I think he just didn't know which direction. Cascadia Recovery and Wellness Center had pale blue walls and the smell of lavender from a diffuser in the reception area, and the particular brand of forced calm that belongs to places where the doors lock from the outside. Vanessa handled the intake paperwork herself. She sat beside me at the reception desk and slid forms across to me, one at a time, her pen already hovering over the signature lines, her voice low and soothing as she explained each one. Routine assessment forms, she said. Insurance authorization. A temporary care agreement allowing the facility to hold me for an initial evaluation period of up to 7 days if the medical team determined it was warranted. I signed them all. Every form she put in front of me, including the one that allowed the facility to hold me for up to 7 days. My hand was steady. I had decided somewhere on the highway between Portland and Salem that I was going to be very, very good at this, and that meant giving them exactly what they expected to see. A cooperative old man who didn't know what he was signing. She kissed my cheek at the door to my room and told me she'd call in the morning. Her eyes were wet, convincingly wet, I'll give her that, and she squeezed my hands and said she loved me and that this was going to help. Then she walked back down the pale blue hallway, and I listened to her footsteps until I couldn't hear them anymore. I sat on the edge of the bed in room 14 and looked at the window. It had a latch, but no lock. Outside, a courtyard with a single bare oak tree, its branches black against the January sky. The following afternoon, I told a nurse I was ready to go home. She smiled with practiced warmth and told me Dr. Cobb would need to complete his evaluation before any discharge decisions could be made. I asked when that would be. She said it depended on the assessment process. I asked to use a phone. She said personal devices weren't permitted during the initial evaluation period, but I was welcome to use the facility phone to contact family. I declined that particular offer. Dr. Martin Cobb was 55 years old, broad-shouldered with reading glasses. He wore pushed up on his forehead, and the unhurried manner of a man who had spent 22 years in this field and was no longer surprised by very much. He came to my room the first morning for what he called an intake conversation, which was really an assessment, the kind designed to establish baseline cognitive function orientation, emotional stability. We talked for 90 minutes. He asked me what year it was, who the current governor of Oregon was, what I'd had for breakfast, whether I knew where I was, and why I was there. He asked about my career, my family, my financial situation. He asked how I'd been sleeping and whether I'd experienced any episodes of confusion or memory loss. I answered every question clearly, completely, and in the correct order. He came back the next morning, and the morning after that. On the third day, he came in and sat down across from me and didn't open his folder. He just looked at me for a moment, with the particular attention of a man who is reconciling what he expected to find with what's actually in front of him. "Mr. Bennett," he said, "I've been doing this for 22 years. I've seen a lot of intake files." He paused. "Yours concerns me." "In what way?" I asked, though I already knew. "The referring physician's number goes to a voicemail that's been disconnected. The medical history summary contains a diagnosis code I can't verify in any of your previous records we've been able to access." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "And the video documentation your daughter submitted, I've reviewed it carefully. The editing is inconsistent. There are cuts I can't account for." He held my gaze. "I've seen this twice before in 22 years. Both times it was a family member." My chest tightened so hard it hurt. Not from fear. From something closer to relief, the specific, exhausting relief of being seen accurately after a very long time of being deliberately misread. "Dr. Cobb," I said, "I need to tell you something." I told him everything. I spoke for 40 minutes without stopping, and he listened without interrupting. And when I finished, he sat back in his chair and was quiet for a long moment. "Your daughter filed an emergency guardianship petition with the Marion County Circuit Court yesterday," he said. Under Oregon law, that petition requires a supporting medical statement from a licensed physician at this facility before a judge will consider it. He looked at me steadily. I'm not going to sign that statement. Without Dr. Cobb's medical statement, the petition lacked the required clinical documentation under Oregon law. The court declined to issue a temporary emergency order. Caroline filed a counter-petition the following morning, attaching the certified lab results showing the presence of sedatives in my medication. The guardianship filing was formally dismissed 3 days later. Dr. Cobb brought me his personal cell phone that afternoon and stood in the hallway while I called Carolyn. She answered on the first ring. "Are you all right?" she said. "I'm fine," I said. "Martin Cobb is a good man. Can you leave?" "Yes." I looked out the window at the bare oak tree in the courtyard, its branches holding the gray January sky. "But I'm going to stay 2 more days." A pause. Then Caroline, who understood exactly what I meant. "All right. I'll tell Frank." I handed the phone back to Dr. Cobb. He looked at me with an expression I can only describe as the specific respect one careful person extends to another. 2 more days, he said. 2 more days. I agreed. Back in Lake Oswego, I would learn later the cameras were already running. Frank was already watching. And Vanessa was walking through the front door of my house with a new set of keys in her hand, and 3 hours of daylight left to do what she'd been planning for 8 months. Frank sent me updates in short, precise text messages, the way a surgeon narrates a procedure. No editorializing, just what was happening and when. 5:47 p.m. Both inside, changing locks front and back. I was sitting in room 14 at Cascadia, the bare oak tree dark against the evening sky, eating a dinner I didn't taste. I read the message and set my phone face down on the tray and took a slow breath through my nose. 6:12 p.m. Office. Going through the desk. I thought about Joyce's letter opener, the one shaped like a heron that her sister had given her for Christmas in 1994, still sitting in the top right drawer where it had always been. I thought about Vanessa's hands going through that drawer, and something tightened in my chest that I breathed through carefully, the way you breathe through pain when making noise won't help. 6:31 p.m. Safe. She found the envelope. I put the phone down and looked at the ceiling for a long time. I had thought about what would happen when Vanessa opened that envelope and found the blank piece of paper inside. I had imagined several versions of the scene, her confusion, her anger, her recalculation. What I had not fully anticipated was what Frank texted me 11 minutes later. 6:42 p.m. They're arguing, she's talking, recording everything. The argument, Frank told me later, started because Ethan panicked when he saw the envelope. He grabbed Vanessa's arm and told her they needed to leave, that Richard knew that the whole thing was finished, that they should cut their losses and get out before the situation got worse. Vanessa turned on him with a fury that, by Frank's account, was something to witness. "He doesn't know anything," she snapped, her voice carrying clearly to the camera above the storage shelves. "He's sitting in a facility in Salem with no phone and no way to verify anything. All he has is an empty envelope and a guess." "That envelope was a message," Ethan said, his voice cracking at the edges. "Vanessa, that was a message. He knows we were going to look in that safe. He knows we might look in the safe." She corrected, her voice dropping back to the flat, efficient register I had heard through the garage door a month earlier. "That's not the same thing. We stay on schedule." She turned away from him and began moving through the garage with the focused energy of someone who had rehearsed this in her head many times. She told Ethan where to position the boxes, which labels to put face out, how to arrange the shipping materials so they looked like they'd been there for months rather than hours. Her voice was steady and certain and entirely without hesitation. and listening to Frank's account of it later, I kept thinking about the girl who used to fall asleep in the back seat of our old Subaru, entirely trusting, entirely safe. That girl was gone. I don't know exactly when it happened or what replaced her, but she was gone. At 8:47, Ethan made a mistake. He picked up one of the product boxes and turned it over in his hands, looking at the label, and said quietly, more to himself than to Vanessa, "When they trace this back, it's your name on the original supplier contracts, not mine. Yours and the fake account you set up with his license." Vanessa turned to look at him. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I didn't forge his signature on a $190,000 loan," Ethan said, and his voice had found something harder underneath the panic. "I didn't create a fake email account in his name. I didn't swap out his medication." He set the box down. "You did all of that. I went along with it." The garage was quiet for a moment, except for the sound of traffic on the street outside. "Yes," Vanessa said. "You did go along with it. Which means we're in this together, so I suggest you stop making speeches and finish stacking those boxes." But the camera had heard everything. Frank's server in Hillsboro, Oregon, had recorded every word, every admission, every specific detail of what Vanessa had done and how she had done it. The forged signature, the fake email account, the medication, tampering, the fraudulent guardianship filing. All of it in her own voice on a timestamp that would hold up in any federal courtroom in the country. What neither of them knew, and what I didn't know, until Caroline called me the following morning, was that Ethan had already made a separate move. 3 days before the Salem trip, he had called Carolyn Webb's office from a number she didn't recognize and left a message identifying himself and saying he had information about Vanessa's financial activities and wanted to discuss his options. Caroline had called Frank immediately. Frank had contacted the FBI agents who already had copies of the evidence. And Ethan, after a conversation with a defense attorney named Gregory Marsh that lasted 2 hours, had agreed to serve as a cooperating witness, providing documented testimony about Vanessa's role in the forged loan, the fraudulent guardianship petition, and the medication tampering in exchange for consideration in the charging decisions against him. The cooperation agreement was signed the morning I was sitting in Dr. Cobb's office, learning that the guardianship petition had been denied. When Caroline told me on the phone the next day, I sat with it for a moment. Ethan turning on Vanessa. Vanessa's voice on the camera saying, "You did go along with it." The whole structure of their arrangement collapsing inward from both directions simultaneously. "Is it enough?" I asked Caroline. "It's more than enough," she said. "Frank got everything we needed. The agents are ready when you say go." A pause. "Richard, Vanessa called me an hour ago. She wants to organize a gathering at your house. She's calling it a family support meeting. She's already invited Sandra and Pastor Dale and Harold." I looked out the window at the bare oak tree in the Cascadia courtyard, its branches beginning to hold the pale light of a January morning. "Let her," I said. "Tell Frank to be ready. Tell the agents Tuesday evening." I thought for a moment. "And Caroline, she still doesn't know I'm coming home." Before I reveal what happened inside that room, drop 2 in the comments, so I know you're still here with me. 60 years of living. 8 months of preparation. 1 door. Some elements of this story are fictional included to make the message land more clearly. If that's not what you signed up for, feel free to step away, and thank you for listening this far. I stood outside the front door of my own house and listened to my daughter's voice coming through the walls. In my coat pocket was a key, a copy Frank had made the morning after Vanessa changed the locks. She had changed them. He had anticipated that she would. She was telling a story about the last time she'd visited me, how I'd forgotten where I'd put my keys, how she'd found them in the refrigerator, how she'd laughed it off because she didn't want to worry me, but inside she'd been terrified. The people in the room made sympathetic sounds. Someone said, "Bless her heart." Someone else said she was such a devoted daughter. I had never put my keys in the refrigerator. Caroline stood to my left, her coat buttoned against the February cold. Frank was to my right, a bag over one shoulder, containing the projection equipment he'd carry inside. Behind us, two special agents from the FBI's Portland field office waited near the street patient, and unhurried the way people are when they've done this many times before. I put my hand on the door handle. Inside, Vanessa was dressed in black, not dramatically, just a dark sweater and slacks understated, and appropriate for a woman carrying a heavy burden. She had arranged the living room so that she stood at one end near the fireplace with everyone else seated facing her, which I recognized as the configuration of someone who wanted to control where people looked. Sandra Kowalski sat in the front row in Joyce's armchair, her hands folded in her lap, her face soft with concern. She had brought flowers. I could see them on the hall table, the same tulips she always brought, and something about those tulips made my throat tighten in a way I hadn't expected. Harold stood near the back wall with his arms crossed and his jaw set, the expression of a man containing something large. Lori Simmons sat near the window, very still, her eyes on the floor in front of her. She had not looked up at Vanessa once since I'd begun watching through the gap in the curtains. I had learned from Harold that Lori had been in the room when Vanessa showed off a $2,000 handbag, the same afternoon she'd called her father, asking for grocery money. Lori had said nothing then. She was saying nothing now. But her silence had a different quality than Sandra's credulous attention. It was the silence of someone who knew too much and had not yet decided what to do with it. Pastor Dale sat in the middle of the room with his coat still on, which told me he hadn't planned to stay long. Vanessa was speaking in the careful, measured voice she used when she wanted to sound like she was barely holding herself together. "I want to be honest with everyone," she said, pressing one hand briefly to her chest. "Dad's decline has been harder to watch than I expected. He doesn't always know what day it is. He's been making financial decisions that concern us deeply, moving money around, changing accounts, things that don't make sense given his situation." Her voice dropped. "Ethan and I have given everything we have to support him. And I know he would hate for me to say this, but we're at a point where we need the community's help, and we need to make sure the right decisions are being made about his care and his assets going forward." She reached for a folder on the mantelpiece. That was when Pastor Dale Whitmore stood up. He was 67 years old, and he had spent 50 of those years reading rooms, and the room he was reading right now had apparently told him something he couldn't sit still for. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't point. He just stood up and said in the mild, unhurried tone of a man asking for directions, "Vanessa, does your father know about this gathering?" The room shifted. Sandra looked up. Lori's head came off the floor for the first time. Harold uncrossed his arms. Vanessa opened her mouth to answer. The front door opened. I walked in. The room went so quiet, so fast, that I could hear the refrigerator humming in the kitchen, and the sound of a car passing on the street outside. Vanessa's face went through 3 expressions in the space of 2 seconds: shock, then something that might have been fear, then the practiced warmth clicking back into place like a mechanism engaging. She crossed the room and wrapped her arms around me, and I could feel her heart hammering against my chest, and she said into my shoulder in a voice designed to carry to every person in the room, "Dad, oh my God, you're okay. I've been so worried about you, I've been out of my mind." I put my hands on her arms and stepped back. I held her at arm's length and looked at her face, really looked at it the way I had at the birthday party, taking in every detail, and I said quietly, just to her, just between us, "You weren't worried about me, Vanessa. You were worried I'd come home too soon." Her breath caught. Her hands, still on my arms, went very still. Then Caroline walked in behind me. Then Frank with his bag. Nobody in that room looked at Frank. They were all looking at me. That was the point. Then Dr. Ellen Walsh and Dr. Martin Cobb and the two agents filed in behind them, and the room, which had been very quiet, became something else entirely. Sandra Kowalski made a sound like a small animal. Harold's jaw unclenched for the first time all evening. Laurie Simmons looked up at Vanessa with an expression I recognized. It was the look of someone who had been waiting a long time to stop pretending they didn't know what they knew. Ethan, standing near the kitchen doorway, looked at the two agents and went the color of old paper. Vanessa took one step backward. Then she straightened her spine and lifted her chin and turned to face the room. And I saw her make the decision, the same decision she had been making her whole adult life, to perform her way through this. "Everyone," she said, her voice steady and warm and completely unconvincing. "I think there's been a misunderstanding." "There hasn't," I said. I nodded to Frank. He set his bag down, opened his laptop, and connected it to the portable projector he'd positioned facing the far wall. The white rectangle of light appeared above the fireplace, and the room turned to look at it, and I took a breath that went all the way down. "There are some things," I said, "that I need to show you." I had thought about this moment for months. I had imagined it in Caroline's office in the dark of my bedroom at 2 in the morning, sitting in room 14 at Cascadia, watching a bare oak tree hold the winter sky. I had run through every version what I would say, what she would say, how the room would feel. I had prepared for it the way I prepared for every difficult job in 40 years of maintenance work, methodically, completely, without leaving anything to chance. But when I actually stood there in the living room of the house Joyce and I had built together, with the white rectangle of Frank's projector on the wall above the fireplace, and 30 years of photographs looking down from the shelves, the first thing I felt was not satisfaction. It was grief. Clean and simple and entirely unexpected. I grieved for the version of this room I would never get back, the one where Vanessa sat in her mother's chair and told stories about Joyce, where Cooper ran in through the front door with a drawing in his fist, where the yellow kitchen at the end of the hall was just a kitchen and not a crime scene backdrop. I let myself feel that for exactly one breath. Then I began. In March of 2022, I said, "My daughter asked me for a loan, $18,000. She said the business was struggling, and she needed a bridge to get through a rough patch." I looked at the room, Sandra's wide eyes, Harold's locked jaw, Pastor Dale's hands folded in his lap. Over the following 3 years, across 11 separate requests, I transferred a total of $137,000 to Vanessa and Ethan. Not $1 was ever repaid. Not one conversation about repayment was ever initiated. Frank clicked to the first slide. Bank statements highlighted in yellow, each transfer dated and labeled. "I want to show you what that money was spent on." The next slide was a grid of receipts: a Chanel handbag purchased 3 days after the first loan, a Cartier watch 2 weeks after the second, a designer coat. The same afternoon, Vanessa had sat at my kitchen table with red eyes and told me she didn't know how she was going to pay Cooper's preschool tuition. Sandra made a sound in the front row. A small wounded sound, like something tearing. Vanessa stepped forward. "Those documents are fabricated," she said, and her voice was still steady, still warm, still performing. "Dad, whoever put this together, the woman who first noticed something was wrong," I said, "was a bank employee named Deb Morrison. She flagged a proxy authorization form that had been submitted to give Vanessa full control of my accounts. The signature on that form was not mine." I nodded to Frank. "She did her job. Because of her, we started looking." The next slides came in sequence. The collection notice for $190,000 in a loan I never took. The fake email address. The credit report damage. The Oregon Department of Justice cease and desist against Vanessa's business for selling counterfeit goods, $86,000 in fines inventory, seized federal investigation ongoing. Ethan's gambling debts documented across 4 creditors totaling $260,000. The emails to the 3 real estate brokers describing me as an elderly family member transitioning to long-term care. With each slide, the room changed. Sandra had both hands pressed against her mouth. Lori Simmons was gripping the arm of her chair so hard her knuckles had gone white. Pastor Dale had not moved, but his eyes, which had been gentle all evening, had become something different, not anger exactly, but the expression of a man confronting the distance between what he'd believed and what was true. Ethan, near the kitchen doorway, had stopped looking at the screen. He was looking at the floor. "None of this is real," Vanessa said again, but her voice had lost something, a fraction of its certainty, a degree of its warmth. "Dad, you've been manipulated by people who want to take advantage of you. Caroline Webb has a financial interest in 3 months ago. I said I woke up face down on my kitchen table with no memory of falling asleep. I had been drinking tea that Vanessa brought me." I looked at Dr. Ellen Walsh. "Dr. Walsh." Ellen stepped forward and opened the folder she'd been holding. The medication found in Mr. Bennett's prescription bottle was analyzed at a CLI A-certified laboratory, a federally accredited facility whose results are admissible in any court in this country. Her voice was precise and unhurried. 2 of his 4 daily blood pressure pills had been replaced with a low-dose benzodiazepine sedative. Taken regularly, this compound produces dizziness, cognitive sluggishness, and episodic disorientation symptoms that closely resemble early cognitive decline. She closed the folder. "This constitutes criminal tampering under Oregon Revised Statute 164.877. The room made a sound I can't describe exactly. Not a gasp. Something more collective than that, the sound of people revising their understanding of something they thought they knew. Vanessa's hands at her sides had curled into fists. "And then," I said, "there was Salem." Dr. Martin Cobb spoke for 4 minutes. He described the intake documentation, the disconnected physician's number, the unverifiable diagnosis codes, the video footage that had been edited in ways he could not account for. He described the emergency guardianship petition Vanessa had filed with the Marion County Circuit Court, and his refusal to provide the supporting medical statement it required, and the court's denial of the petition within 24 hours. He described 30 conversations with me over 5 days, and his professional conclusions stated plainly and without qualification that I was one of the most cognitively intact individuals he had assessed in 22 years of practice. "She told that facility," I said, "that I had a history of paranoid ideation and was a danger to myself. I have the text messages." Frank put them on the screen. Vanessa's words in her own digital handwriting to the Cascadia intake coordinator. "Patient will present as resistant and possibly confused." The room read them in silence, a real silence this time, the silence of people absorbing something that couldn't be unsaid. "That's not—" Vanessa started. "Then there's the camera footage," I said. The first video was 40 seconds long. Vanessa and Ethan in my garage changing the locks on my front door with a set of keys that were not theirs. Ethan stacking boxes along the far wall. Vanessa moving through the space with the practiced efficiency of someone who had imagined doing this many times. The second video was longer. It showed Vanessa at my office, safe opening it, finding the envelope. It showed her face when she read the line inside. "Were you looking for this?" The way the performance dropped for just a moment, just long enough for the camera to catch what was underneath. The third video was the one that mattered most. Ethan's voice. I didn't forge his signature on a $190,000 loan. I didn't create a fake email account in his name. I didn't swap out his medication. You did all of that. Vanessa's voice flat and certain, yes. You did go along with it. which means we're in this together. The room was absolutely still. Vanessa's face had gone the color of the pale blue walls at Cascadia. She turned to Ethan, and the look she gave him was not anger. It was something colder than anger, something that had stopped pretending to be human emotion. Ethan did not look back at her. "Ethan contacted my attorney 3 days before the Salem trip," I said. "He provided documented testimony regarding Vanessa's role in the forged loan, the fraudulent guardianship petition, and the medication tampering. He has entered into a cooperation agreement with federal investigators." I paused. "The recording you just heard was part of what he provided." Vanessa turned to face me. For one moment, just one, the performance was entirely gone. Her face was bare and young and furious, and something else I didn't have a word for, something that might have been the beginning of understanding what she had actually done. Then the fury took over. "It doesn't matter," she said, and her voice cracked on the first word, and she pushed through it. "None of this matters. I am your only child. Whatever you've set up, whatever legal structure you think protects that house when you're gone, it comes to me. It has to. I'm all you have left." The room waited. "No," I said. "You lost it months ago." I nodded to Caroline. She opened her own folder. "The property at Wisteria Lane in Lake Oswego," I said, "was transferred into the Joyce Bennett Memorial Trust in December of last year under Oregon Revised Statutes, Chapter 130. This morning, before I walked through that door, I signed an amendment converting it to an irrevocable trust. Caroline filed it with the county recorder at 9 a.m. I let that land for a moment. "After my death, the assets of the trust will be liquidated and the proceeds divided between 2 beneficiaries, a housing assistance program for widows and widowers in the Portland metro area, and a scholarship fund for first-generation college students in the Portland Public Schools District. The scholarship fund will carry Joyce's name." Sandra Kowalski put her face in her hands and began to cry, not quietly, not politely, but with the full-bodied, unself-conscious grief of a woman who had loved Joyce Bennett for 30 years and was only now understanding the full shape of what had been done in her memory. "There is one additional provision," I said. "A separate educational trust has been established for Cooper Carr and any future siblings. The funds become accessible when each child reaches the age of 25. Their parents have no legal access to those funds under any circumstances." Vanessa made a sound I had never heard from her before. Not crying. Something rawer than crying, the sound of someone realizing that the thing they came for was never going to be theirs, and that the door they expected to walk through had been bricked over from the other side and had been for months. The 2 agents stepped forward. The taller one, a woman with close-cropped hair and the quiet authority of someone who had made this announcement many times, said, "Vanessa Bennett Carr, we're asking you to come with us for questioning regarding charges, including bank fraud, identity theft, wire fraud, healthcare fraud, criminal tampering, filing a fraudulent guardianship petition, and conspiracy to commit evidence planting. You have the right to have an attorney present." The second agent stepped toward Ethan and said quietly, "Mr. Carr, your attorney has already been contacted. You'll come in separately per your agreement with our office." Ethan nodded without looking at anyone and followed the agent out through the kitchen door. Vanessa stood very still for a moment, and then she turned to look at me one last time. Not at the room, not at the agents, just at me. And I held her gaze because I owed her that much, and because I wanted her to see that I was not angry, and I was not triumphant, and I was not destroyed. I was just a man who had done what needed to be done. She walked out. The room began to move again slowly, the way rooms do after something large has passed through them. Sandra was still crying, her tulips still on the hall table, entirely out of place and entirely right. Pastor Dale crossed the room and put one hand briefly on my shoulder, without saying anything, which was more than enough. Lori Simmons slipped out the front door without making eye contact with anyone, and I thought she probably had some calls to make and some things to reconsider, and I hoped she would. Harold came and stood beside me. "You doing okay?" he said. I looked around the living room, the photographs on the shelves, the oak table visible through the doorway to the kitchen, the yellow walls catching the lamplight, the way they always had. The house looked exactly like it always had. That was the strange thing. Everything that had happened here tonight, and the yellow walls were just yellow walls. "Yeah," I said. "I think I am." Harold looked at me for a moment, with the expression of a man who knows you well enough to know when you're telling the truth. Then he said, "You want to get something to eat?" We walked out through the kitchen. I stopped at the doorway and looked at it one last time, the yellow walls Joyce had painted herself on an October afternoon 31 years ago, the oak table from the garage sale in Milwaukee, the window over the sink where the morning light came in and turned everything gold. I reached back and turned off the light. The letter from Vanessa came on a Thursday. I made coffee first. Then I read it. She said she was sorry. She said Ethan had manipulated her. She said she was my only child, and that had to count for something. I wrote one line on the back of the envelope. "You didn't lose me because you were desperate. You lost me because you chose money over the truth, and then chose the lie over coming home." I put it in the mail and didn't look back. God doesn't promise the people we love will love us honestly in return. He only promises we have the strength to survive when they don't. If someone measures your worth before they measure what you mean, that is not love. That is a family drama revenge story you never auditioned for. Don't wait as long as I did. Don't confuse someone's need for your money with their need for you. These family stories, revenge situations, build quietly, one check at a time. Real love doesn't keep score, but it doesn't stay silent when the cost becomes your dignity. I have a napkin list. 4 places left. Harold is already packed. Family stories, revenge don't end in courtrooms. They end with a man driving toward the mountains and the rest of his life finally his own. If this story reached you, leave a comment, share it, and subscribe. Family drama, revenge, and family stories. Revenge stories like this remind us all what we're worth. Thank you for staying until the end. Some stories ahead contain fictionalized elements crafted for reflection. If that's not your journey, step away kindly and find what feeds you. We'll see you in the next one.